Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for another Sporty's webinar. My name is John Zimmerman. I'm pleased you can be with us today for IFR Quiz Hour. Hopefully this is a fun and fast-paced way to spend an hour brushing up on your instrument flying knowledge. Hopefully if you're new to IFR world, this will be educational, and hopefully if you're an old pro, we'll give you at least something that will make you think hard. Very excited to have you join us today. For another webinar. A couple of housekeeping things as we get started. Like all webinars, this will be recorded, so this will be available on Sporty's YouTube channel within the next 48 hours. So if you missed something today, you want to watch it again, feel free to come back and watch the video recording. Also, you'll note in your GoToWebinar control panel down at the bottom in the handouts section, I have included a PDF with all of the questions today. Some of the questions, as you can imagine with instrument flying, get a little complicated with approach charts and other graphics. And because of the GoToWebinar software today, sometimes some of those are not going to be able to be shown the whole time. So you might take a moment just now and download that PDF. You might want to open it up. You might even want to print it out if you've got a printer close at hand. It's not required, but you may find it easy on some of the more complicated questions if you have the questions with the figure there to refer to with you. While you're doing that, tell you a little bit about me. Again, my name is John Zimmerman. I work at Sporty's right there on the runway at the Claremont County Airport in Batavia, Ohio. And really a great place to work. We get to work with all kinds of fun products. We get to fly because we love it. I get to do a lot of instrument flying. I'm an ATP, fly helicopters as well as airplanes, and I'm also an instrument ground instructor, and that's kind of the hat I'll be wearing today. We'll be talking about instrument ground school type topics. But I'm going to try to keep it mostly practical. So yes, most of these questions are the type of questions you would see on a FAA written test, but hopefully they also are really practical and applicable for the type of flying you're going to do. All right, so if everybody has got everybody who wants to has the PDF downloaded, just run through two more quick slides and then we'll dive right in. Quick plug here for Sporty's pilot training app. This is our cross-platform training program. We have over 25 courses here, everything from learning to fly to our comprehensive instrument rating course, avionics training from ForeFlight to Garmin G1000, an aviation weather course, communications, really everything you could need, even a new aerobatics course with Patty Wagstaff that we launched this week. And those are available on a variety of devices, your iPad, your iPhone, your Android device, Apple TV, Roku, online web browser, you name it. So if you really want to brush up on your instrument flying, check out Sporty's pilot training app. It's free to download and try out. And then the two courses that might be of interest to you is our complete instrument rating course or our instrument proficiency check. If you're already rated and just need a quick brush up, you might check that out. So here's a quick overview right before we dive in. I'm going to present 20 multiple choice questions today. I'll give you some time to read the question, look at the chart if there is one, and answer on screen. They'll be presented multiple choice up on screen. Click on the answer you like. Once everyone's had a chance to make their vote, so to speak, I'll share those results, and then we'll show the right answer and then discuss it. So if you have some confusion, hopefully in the discussion portion for each of these, we'll answer that question. And then a reminder that the handout there in the GoToWebinar software has the questions if you need to refer to a figure. All right, with that, we're going to dive right in. Maybe, hopefully, warm you up here with a question that isn't too bad. So, question one. In here, we are flying the ILS to runway 36 at Oshkosh, of course, because it's Oshkosh week. So let's all pretend we're going to Oshkosh. In this case, though, we're actually doing the localizer runway 36 approach. What is the minimum altitude we should cross the Pober intersection at, the outer marker, for this approach? 3,000, 2,700, or 2,610? Go ahead and click on your vote there. And click submit. All right. Looks like most of you have voted here, so I'll give it just a couple more seconds. Go ahead and make your final vote. And we'll close it up. All right, so good job, everybody. The majority of you said 2,700 feet. That is the correct answer. Hopefully that wasn't too hard, but just a reminder, and sorry, it looks like this graphic is a little garbled, but we're on the localizer approach. So we're not flying the glide slope here. It's not the ILS. And that means we've got to obey those mandatory altitudes. And when you look at the profile view on the approach plate, you'll notice that that underlined altitude, 2,700, if I go back here, 2,700 is underlined right here. So that is a mandatory altitude. That means at or above 2,700 feet. If we were flying the ILS, you would use that glide slope intersection altitude. That's the 2610. Again, if I go back here, right above that Maltese cross here, 2610, that is telling you that's going to be the altitude you'll be at if you intercept the glide slope at the outer marker. But you notice it's not underlined, it's a little bit smaller. That's really sort of advisory. So on the localizer approach, we need to fly that mandatory altitude until crossing the outer marker, and then we descend. The big takeaway here, I think, is on a instrument approach, really any instrument approach, ask yourself, is this a precision or a non-precision approach? Precision approach, we have an actual glide slope we're going to fly. We're really less interested in specific altitudes. We're going to probably be cleared for the approach at a certain altitude. We'll intercept the glide slope, fly it down to our decision height. If it's a non-precision approach, we're going to maintain altitude until we cross a fix, then descend to another altitude and level out. That's pretty obvious on a lot of approaches, you know, maybe localizer versus ILS, but as we do more and more WAS approaches, sometimes that's less obvious. So is it an LPV approach or is it an LNAV approach? And I have a glide slope, but it's really an advisory glide slope. That's the difference. An LPV is an actual precision approach, although we can argue about the ICAO definition of a precision approach. If it looks like a precision approach and walks like a precision approach, it is. But on an LNAV approach with a WAS GPS, you may have a glide slope, but it's really an advisory glide path, not a glide slope. So anytime you're flying an approach, ask yourself, what kind of approach is this, precision or non-precision? Okay, question 2. Now we're at Billings, Montana. We're gonna fly the VOR DME runway 28 right approach, but we're gonna circle for runway 10 left. Your VSO, your stall speed, is 72 knots. And since we're circling, we might be thinking about category that you see down there at the bottom of the approach plate. What approach category should we use for this approach, given that our VSO is 72 knots? I will launch the multiple choice here, and you can make your selection. So as a reminder, there's 4 categories, A, B, C, and D. I've listed 3 here because that's our limit, but category A, B, or C, go ahead and get those votes in. I'll close it up here in just a second. All right, so this was kind of a split decision here. 59% said A, 38% said B, and 4% said C. Correct answer is B. So 38% of you got that one right. Here's a refresher. This may not be top of mind for you, but here's a refresher. Category A, less than 91 knots. Category B goes from 91 to 121 knots. Category C, 121 to 141. Great, but what speed do we use? Well, we go to the AIM, Chapter 5, Section 4, and it says, based on a speed of VREF, if specified, or VREF is not specified, 1.3 times VSO at the maximum certified landing weight. I think it's important to point out here that the second part of that, VREF, VSO, and the maximum certified landing weight are those values as established for the aircraft by the certification authority. Basically meaning you don't get to make up VREF. And if you're flying a jet, you probably have very specific published VREF numbers. If you're flying a Cherokee or a 172, you probably don't have a VREF number. You might have a recommended approach speed. You certainly have VSO, you have a stalling speed, and in that case, you would calculate 1.3 times VSO. But make sure you are using the book number for that to calculate which category you're in. But The part at the bottom is also important, particularly on a circling approach. If you level out and you're going to be motoring around the pattern a little bit, you may be speeding up. So this is a slightly more recent update. It says, if it is necessary to operate at a speed in excess of the upper limit of the speed range for an aircraft's category, the minimums for the higher category must be used. And this is pretty clear. It says must be used, but I'd like to point out that this is just a good idea anyway. If you're right on the edge, if you're, your 1.3 VSO is going to be 118 knots, but you think you might speed up as you circle the land and you're going to be going 130 knots, it just makes sense to give you a little more buffer, to give you a little more wiggle room and use that higher category. So for me, at least, while it may not be technically required all the time, I like to be conservative, and if you're on the edge, maybe bump it up a level and use that higher category. Okay, let's get into some weather. Question 3. What are some characteristics of unstable air? Option A would be nimbostratus clouds with good surface visibility. Option B is turbulence and good surface visibility. Or option C, poor surface visibility and turbulence. Launch that poll. This one does not require a graphic, just your head, so think that through and make a selection. All right, couple more seconds here. Looks like we've got a good number of votes coming in here. If you haven't voted, take a second to make that choice, and we'll close up this quick poll. All right, so pretty strong majority here. 74% of you said turbulence and good surface visibility, with an even split between the other two. Well, that's a good job, because that's the correct answer. Turbulence and good surface visibility is correct. This is one of my, I guess, hobby horses I'd get on when it comes to aviation weather. To me, stability is often overlooked. We think in terms of, yellow on the radar or whatever it might be, but you really want to think about the atmosphere you're flying in, the air mass you're flying in. And stability really tells you a lot about whether that cloud is going to be smooth and maybe a light shower, or bumpy in a really rough ride. And clouds can give you a great view of this. If that's cumulus cloud is brightly defined, puffy white edges and growing vertically that so fast you can see it, that's one thing versus a kind of a flat gray stratus cloud. So think about not just what is the METAR or TAF say, what does the radar say, but what is the stability of this air mass? And so if we're talking about, unstable air, yeah, a lot of times you're going to see, think of in some cases, a summer day where it's a bright blue sky morning, but it heats up, those thermals start building, the clouds start developing vertically. And that can turn into more than just rain. That can turn into clouds you want to avoid, even if there's no rain in them showing up on the radar. It could be a rough ride. All right, question 4. Look at some FARs. We're flying over areas designated as mountainous terrain, and when there's no other minimum altitude prescribed, what is our minimum? In other words, no person may operate an aircraft IFR below an altitude of what? We'll launch the poll here. Make your selection on screen there. Or over mountainous terrain, what's our IFR altitude we need to be aware of? 500 feet above the highest obstacle, 1,000 feet, or 2,000 feet? All right, everybody's pretty certain on this one, so I'm going to go ahead and close it up here. And we have overwhelming 82% of you say 2,000 feet above the highest obstacle. You're confident because you were correct. Yes, 2,000 feet. Many of you probably remember this, 1,000 feet above in normal areas, 2,000 in mountainous. Here's, if you want to quote chapter and verse, FAR 91.177. One thing I think is worth pointing out here, maybe that it gets forgotten, is above the highest obstacle within a horizontal distance of 4 nautical miles from the course to be flown. So that is your route corridor, if you want to think of it that way. This is actually fairly easy to determine these days with EFB apps. You can, use ruler tools in ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot and look at your route. You can even turn on the terrain view and set those settings. So yes, this is legal, but it's also a good way to plan for a flight. And I think we have the tools now to actually do this. Whereas before, maybe it was a lot of pencil work and plotters or even just an educated guess. This time, I think we've got the tools to actually do this before flight. What are those mountainous areas? Well, this is the awesome high resolution graphic that the FAA provides, but it's pretty much what you'd expect. It's the Western US, pretty much Colorado, Wyoming border and west over the Rockies. There's a little cutout over in the valley in California there, and then over the Appalachians and up into the Pennsylvania, upstate New York, Vermont, into Maine. So pretty much the areas you would expect. Just something to keep in mind. I'm based in Cincinnati, Ohio. If I'm flying down to the coast of South Carolina or Georgia or Florida, you're going to start out in non-mountainous terrain. You're going to go over mountainous area, and then you're going to be back in non-mountainous. So when you think about minimum altitudes, it can change during the flight. All right, question 5. Let's go back to an approach plate. How should the pilot identify the missed approach point for the ILS runway 10 right approach to Portland International? You can see the chart there. The options here, option A is arrival at 223 feet on the glide slope, arrival at 2.0 DME on the localizer, or the time is expired for the distance from the final approach fix to the missed approach point. Let me launch that and go ahead and vote. All right, looks like we've got most votes coming in here. So if you haven't, go ahead and get that vote in right now. I'm going to close up the poll. Again, you're pretty much in agreement on this one. 77% say arrival at 223 feet on the glide slope. And once again, you're right. That is correct. Again, this goes back to kind of that first question. Think about whether you're flying a non-precision or a precision approach. A non-precision approach has a minimum descent altitude, an MDA. That is the minimum altitude we descend to and then level out as we look for the runway. A precision approach where we're flying a glide slope, where you're on glide slope down to a decision height. This is not a level out and look for the runway. Decision height is that. It's time to decide. And if you don't have the runway environment in sight, you are going to fly a missed approach. So you don't keep flying to the runway, you don't keep descending, you don't level out. And that, in fact, is your missed approach point. Lots of ILSs, for example, have other tools. They might have an inner marker if it's a big airport, or a middle marker. You might have a DME on the approach plate. Those are all nice backups, but the actual missed approach point on an ILS is when you're centered on the needles and you're at the decision height. All right, question 6. This one's a little bit more out of the norm. You arrive at your destination airport on an IFR flight plan. What is a prerequisite condition for the performance of a contact approach? Option A is ground visibility of at least 2 statute miles. B is clear clouds and at least 1 statute mile flight visibility. Option C is flight visibility of at least 1 statute mile. All right, looks like a little hesitation. Some of you aren't quite sure, but I'm going to close it up in a few seconds. So if you haven't voted yet, get that in. All right. You all are unanimous today. 83% of you say clear clouds and at least 1 statute mile flight visibility. That's very good. That is the correct answer. B, clear clouds and 1 mile flight visibility. Note that it's 1 statute mile flight visibility. That's not what's reported on the METAR. That's what you see from the cockpit. A couple things to think about on contact approaches. Most of us don't do these very often. I bet I've done 2 for real in my flying career. They can be valuable they can be time saving, they can be convenient, but I really recommend you only do them at airports you know well. I would certainly not do a contact approach into an airport I had not been to before, because you're essentially doing legal scud running here and kind of finding your way to the airport close by in marginal conditions. So some things to remember: you have to ask for contact approach. ATC can offer a visual approach, but they are not going to offer a contact approach. You have to initiate that request. Remember that you need 1 statute mile visibility, and a part that's often overlooked, but this is quoting from the FAA, pilots can reasonably expect to continue to the destination airport in those conditions. So if you break out and you have 1 statute mile visibility, but there's a huge rain shower between you and the airport, you are not legal to continue that contact approach. And number 3, this must be made to an airport having a standard or special instrument approach procedure. So you don't get to do a contact approach to that private airport in the mountains that you go to that has no instrument approach. It's still got to be an instrument airport. And if you want to really geek out on contact approaches, AIM 5-4-62 has all the details. All right, question 7. What is a characteristic of low-level wind shear as it relates to frontal activity? A, with a cold front, the most critical period is just before the front passes the airport. B, turbulence will always exist in wind shear conditions. Or C, with a warm front, the most critical period is before the front passes the airport. I'll launch that and you can make your vote. All right, most of the votes in here, a couple more seconds, and I'm going to close it up. So if you haven't voted, go ahead and make that final selection. All right, this one's a little bit more split. 53% say cold front, the most critical period is just before frontal passage. 21% say it always exists in wind shear. 26% say warm front, the critical period is before frontal passage. All right, let's dive into this one. The correct answer is actually C. When you're talking about a warm front, the most critical period is before the front passes the airport. Quick review of what we mean by wind shear. Wind shear is essentially where 2 air parcels moving in different directions meet, and there's a shear zone between where they meet. So if we have in a most significant way, if you had wind out of the north at 20 knots at 3,000 feet, and at 2,500 feet you had wind out of the south, you would have a shear zone in between. When you think about wind shear, though, it doesn't always have to be turbulent. It often is, and that's what we think of it most of the time, is wind shear means lots of bumps on final. It doesn't have to be. You can be flying an approach and get some low-level wind shear that's not dramatic or aggressive, but can be very, very smooth, but you notice your heading changes dramatically to maintain the localizer, say, or your airspeed or your vertical speed changes. So option B is wrong because turbulence doesn't always exist with wind shear. It's probably most often associated with turbulence, but it's not always. Option C is correct because if you visualize the warm front in 3D as we have here, the warm front, the warm air rises up and kind of overrides the cold air. So whereas a cold front, the cold air sort of stacks up behind the front. In this case, in a lot of ways, the worst weather with a warm front is just ahead of it. And that's what we have here. You can almost visualize the shear zone there between those different air masses. So warm fronts, in spite of their names sounding warm and fuzzy, often can create some pretty bad IFR flying conditions, oftentimes low IFR. In the wintertime, if you're ahead of a warm front on the east side of a low, that often will be the area of worst in-flight icing. So most of the time, in my experience, I fly more around cold fronts, it seems like, and that's a little easier to visualize. But when you think about a warm front, think of how much that's leading out in front of where it shows up on the surface. We're going to be up in the atmosphere ahead of where that surface graphic shows. All right, question 8, we're going to do some unusual attitudes. So here's one. Look closely at this graphic because that will not be available when I launch the poll. So what is the correct sequence for recovery from the unusual attitude indicated here? You see the standard 6-pack with some indications of airspeed, attitude, altitude, vertical speed, heading, and bank. Option A would be reduce power, level the wings, and bring the pitch attitude to level flight. Option B would be level the wings, raise the nose of the aircraft to level flight attitude, and obtain desired airspeed. Or option C, reduce power, increase back elevator pressure, and level the wings. Take one last glance at that. If you don't have the PDF separate, I'm going to launch the poll, so have your choice in mind. And I'm going to launch the poll. All right, got the votes coming in here. Again, if you have the PDF, that's helpful. You can look at the figure. But the airspeed's up in the yellow arc. Vertical speed looks like it's pointed down. The attitude indicator looks like we're showing a bank to the right. So go ahead and get that vote in if you haven't already. And I'll close it up here. All right, another one where you all seem to agree. 84% went with option 1, reduce power, level the wings, bring pitch attitude to level. That is correct. Good job. You all are making your instrument instructors proud today. Lots of ways to approach unusual attitudes. To me, one of the first questions you want to think about is, am I nose high or nose low? You know, what is the threat here? If I'm 30 degrees nose up and I'm in danger of a stall, that's one thing. If I'm 30 degrees nose down and the airspeed's building rapidly, that's a whole nother problem. And in this case, you saw the airspeed was up well into the yellow arc, almost to the red line. The Instrument Flying Handbook has a really good reminder that's obvious, but is something you have to just beat into your head because it goes against what your reptile brain wants to do. A very important point to remember is that the instinctive reaction to a nose down attitude is to pull back on the elevator control. Don't do this because a lot of times this is how you get into a spiral dive, and when you pull back, all you're going to do is tighten the spiral, or potentially, if you're really going fast, you can even cause structural failure in the airframe, maybe rip the wings off. So if you're really disoriented and you find yourself in a dive, it's hard to fight the urge to just pull back and get away from the earth, but you really don't want to do that. As the correct answer here, reduce the power so we stop accelerating as much as we can, level the wings, and then pitch up. There's lots of upset recovery courses out there. Lots of people do them online and in the airplane. Those are valuable. Everybody has kind of their own version of the upset recovery technique. The one that I see most often is some version of this, which is push, meaning unload the wing, let it fly. Power, in this case, reduce because we're going down. Rudder, if you're banked, and then roll the shortest distance to the horizon. But good job on that one. You passed your unusual attitudes. Question 9. An airplane with ice protection systems on its wings, tailplane, propeller, induction system, and pitot-tube. So a lot of ice protection. Is it certificated for flight in known icing conditions? Can it be flown in known icing conditions regardless of certification, just based on the equipment? Or it may or may not be certificated for flight in known icing conditions. Here's the poll. Go ahead and vote. All right. Looks like we've got a lot of votes coming in. Looks like most of you agree once again. I'll give it just a couple more seconds and close up. So if you haven't voted, go ahead and get your vote in. All right, this may be our most unanimous one yet. 94% may or may not be certificated for flight in known icing condition. Very good. That is the correct answer, C. You don't know. Just because it has the ice on its wings and the tail and the induction and pitot tube and all, that's great, but that does not tell you anything about its certification level. Known ice, or FICI as some people call it, flight into known icing airplanes, require specific approval. It's going to be in the manual. I flew a Cessna 210 for years, and for a couple of years it had TKS on the wings and the tail. So the weeping wing had TKS on the propeller, had a heated pitot tube, so it had great ice protection, but it was not approved for known ice or FICI. couple years later, it got upgraded to known ice, and that required the installation of a second pump for the TKS fluid and a whole lot of paperwork. So you really can't tell just based on the equipment. But the bigger point is, a known ice approved or a FIKI airplane is not a free pass to hang out on ice. I fly a Pilatus PC-12 a little bit, and that's a great airplane, and it's got lots of power, and it's got de-ice boots and hot prop and everything you could want, and it's a really good airplane in ice, but it's still uncomfortable to be slogging it out in the clouds with ice. So de-ice equipment is there to buy you time to get to plan B, to climb, descend, turn around, whatever it is. You do not want to be hanging out in icing conditions no matter what the equipment. What is known ice? Well, we could go down this rabbit hole for an hour, but it's not just visible moisture and below freezing temperatures. Some flight instructors will tell you that essentially known ice exists every day in the wintertime. And that's just not true. The FAA came out with about 10 years ago a more reasonable interpretation, I think, of what known icing conditions are. And probably the best quote in there is they really look at it case by case, and would a reasonable and prudent pilot make the same decision? So yeah, if you bend metal, I guess that means they reserve the right to come after you. But I think it's better than some of the more draconian interpretations years ago that said basically, if there's ever an air mat for icing, you flew into known icing conditions and could be subject to enforcement. That's really not what they're saying here. All right, question 10, we're about halfway home. While flying a 3-degree glide slope, a headwind shears to a tailwind. Which conditions should the pilot expect on the glide slope? Airspeed and pitch attitude decrease, and there is a tendency to go below the glide slope. Airspeed and pitch attitude increase, and there is a tendency to go above the glide slope. Or airspeed and pitch attitude decrease, and there is a tendency to remain on the glide slope. I'll launch it, and you can make your selection. All right, a couple more seconds. If you haven't voted, get that vote in. And we're gonna close it up. A little more of a split decision here. 58%, so majority say airspeed and pitch attitude decrease and you'll go below. 39% with airspeed and pitch attitude increase and you go above. I don't blame you for being a little more split on that. The correct answer is A. Airspeed and attitude will decrease and you have a tendency to sink below glide slope. Honestly, I find these kind of wind shear questions on glide slopes confusing. You have to kind of draw it. At least for me, I have to almost draw a diagram. But here's maybe a graphic that shows it in action. I have had this happen, and if you've been flying long, you probably have felt some version of this too. It can be dramatic or can be subtle, but you sort of feel the bottom drop out, sort of like, who threw out the parachute behind the airplane? The best way to recover here is power, right? If you feel that sink and you feel like the airspeed is decreasing, power. If you pull back too much, you can lose even more speed and maybe even approach a stall. So definitely when I'm flying glide slope, I like to control the sink rate and the glide slope primarily with power, and that holds here. All right, compass time, just to torch you. Not that I think any of you are really flying a whole lot of instrument flying with a compass, but you never know. So what should be the indication on the magnetic compass as you roll into a standard rate turn to the right from a south heading in the northern hemisphere? What will the compass do? A, the compass will initially indicate a turn to the left. B, the compass will remain on south for a short time, then gradually catch up to the magnetic heading of the aircraft. Or C, the compass will indicate a turn to the right, but at a faster rate than is actually occurring. I will launch it, and you can make your selection. Okay. Couple seconds here left, so if you haven't voted, go ahead and get that vote in. And I'm going to close it up. Again, a little bit split here. A bare majority say C will indicate a turn to the right, but at a faster rate. 26% with A, 22% with B. Let's look at the facts. Facts are C, so 51% of you are correct. Will indicate a turn to the right, but at a faster rate. Basically, just have to memorize these compass things. You've got your, ands, accelerate north, decelerate south, and your turns and all this. Here's a good graphic from, I believe it's the Airplane Flying Handbook. So on a turn from the south, the compass will lead the turn. And then as you get to west, it'll become more accurate. Again, hopefully none of you are actually flying this, but a great refresher question for your next IPC or maybe a check ride. All right, question 12. Talk about FARs and currency here. How long does a pilot meet the recency of experience requirements for IFR flight after successfully completing an instrument proficiency check if no other flights are made? So you get that IPC and then you don't fly. 6 calendar months, 12 calendar months, or 90 days. I will launch it and you can vote. All right, going to close it up in just a second. If you haven't voted, go ahead and get that vote in. All right, we're back to being more unanimous here. 82% say 6 calendar months. And that's correct. Good job. 6 calendar months is the correct answer. If you want to go look it up, FAR 61.57 may only act as pilot in command when within the last 6 calendar months. This is your typical IFR proficiency and recency of experience requirements, the old 6 approaches in 6 months, plus holding procedures and intercepting and tracking courses. That's what you want to log. But then what happens next? After 6 months, you're out of currency. So you didn't get your 6 approaches in 6 months. Well, you have another 6 months to get current via an IPC. Another 6 months to get current. And then after that 6 months, the only way to get current again is via an instrument proficiency check with an instructor or an examiner. So the FAA gives you the opportunity to do it on your own. And if you don't get it done on your own, then eventually you have to go get with an instructor or an examiner. Okay, back to approach plates. We're at the Riverside Municipal Airport in California now. We are cleared for a straight-in ILS runway 9 approach from over the Pirot intersection. What should you do? A, begin an immediate descent. B, begin final approach. That's misspelled there. Begin final approach without making a procedure turn. Or C, land straight in on runway 9. Launch that poll. All right, going to close it up in just a second. So if you haven't got your vote in, go ahead and make a selection. All right, 80% with B, begin final approach without making a procedure turn. 12% land straight in. So you're correct. The majority of you want to begin final approach without making a procedure turn. That's the key part there. And if you read the chart, you can see Pirot is off to the left side of the chart there. And it says IAF, meaning initial approach fix. And then you see the 3000 no PT. That's your clue that you can go from Pirot to the Jazer intersection there, intermediate fix with no procedure turn. And that's the important thing to remember here is when you get cleared for straight in, you're cleared for the approach, but not the runway. Most likely approach control is going to clear you for the approach, tower is going to clear you to land. So don't confuse those two. But also remember the clearance for an approach is not typically a clearance to descend, at least not until you're established on an approach course. This is the famous accident, I think TWA flight in going into Dulles, but from years and years ago. And that's why the phraseology typically is, maintain 3000 until established, cleared for the ILS 21 left at Lunken, something like that. That's your reminder that you're cleared for the approach, but that doesn't mean you can descend to glide slope intercept altitude, for example. You need to get established on the procedure first. When in doubt here, as a more practical matter, and especially on RNAV approaches, ask ATC. In my experience, a lot of controllers are great on ILS and localizer approaches. You start talking about LPV approaches, they're a little less certain on when you're expected to do a procedure turn and not. It seems like you don't quite as often get vectors outside the final approach fix for a LNAV or an LPV approach, and a lot of times they'll clear you to an initial fix. That's fine, there's no problem with that, but again, in my experience, sometimes the controller is not totally certain on exactly what you're going to do. So if there's ever any doubt, just key the mic and let them know or verify, hey, just so you know, I'm going to hit PRO intersection and fly straight in towards Jaser for the approach. All right, question 14. Let's move from an approach to an arrival. At which location does the Stella One arrival begin? Canaan intersection, Hancock VOR, or Audle intersection? I'll give you a second there to look at the chart, read the description, because again, that's going to be hidden when I launch the poll here. So take a look, review that arrival chart, and then I'm going to launch the poll here. All right, where does the arrival begin? A, Canaan intersection, B, Hancock, C, Audle intersection. All right, a couple more seconds, I'll close it up. So if you haven't voted, get that vote in. All right, a little bit more of a split decision, but not by much. 66% went with Canaan, 20% Hancock VOR, 15% Audle intersection. Correct answer is A, Canaan intersection. So the two parts of an arrival are typically the transition, that's the Stella before the period, and then the arrival, Stella One. And the transition is sort of the top of the funnel where aircraft come in from different parts, maybe from the northwest there at Audle intersection, or from the southwest there, or from the west there at Rockdale. The arrival is really where everybody gets in line. So the arrival is where all the different transitions feed into, and the arrival into the airport starts. You notice the thick dark arrows that start there at Canaan versus the thinner ones before that intersection. Then you can also see in the textual description there, it says for all of these transitions to Canaan INT, thence. So pretty much thence means after that, the arrival starts. All right, back to weather. Question 15, which weather conditions should be expected beneath a low level temperature inversion layer when the relative humidity is high? A, turbulent air and poor visibility due to fog, low stratus type clouds, and showery precipitation. B, smooth air and poor visibility due to fog, haze, or low clouds. C, light wind shear and poor visibility due to haze and light rain. All right, there's the poll. Go ahead and vote. All right, couple more seconds. If you haven't voted, get your votes in. I'm gonna close the poll up here. Another one where you're in agreement, 85% went with B, smooth air and poor visibility due to fog, haze, or clouds. That's the correct answer, B. This is a dramatic picture. This is not probably your typical inversion, but maybe it makes the point starkly. So in a temperature inversion, remember, you've got that warmer air kind of sitting on top like a lid on that colder air. If there's high humidity, then you can anticipate haze, fog, or clouds under the inversion. That is kind of your classic setup for kind of milky marginal VFR conditions. Or if you've got an inversion and you're in the area of kind of a low or a frontal system, it can be pretty bad low IFR conditions. All right, question 16. Still sticking with weather, but a little bit more on the weather regulation side of things. What minimum weather conditions must be forecast for your ETA at an alternate airport that has only a VOR approach with standard alternate minimums in order for that airport to be listed as an alternate on your IFR flight plan? So we need an alternate for our flight plan, and we have an alternate in mind here, and it only has a VOR approach and it has standard alternate minimums. What are the minimums? 1,000-foot ceiling and visibility to allow descent from minimum en route altitude to approach and landing under basic VFR conditions. 800-foot ceiling and 1 statute mile visibility, or 800-foot ceiling and 2 statute mile visibility. There are the options. Please vote. All right, a couple more seconds here and I'm going to close it up. So if you haven't voted, please get your vote in. 66%, 2/3 of you went with C, 800-foot ceiling and 2 statute mile visibility. 20% with 1,000-foot ceiling and VFR, and 14% with 801. Once again, majority is correct here. Option C is the right answer, 802. If you want to look it up, FAR 91.169. Your basic or your standard alternate minimums here, 602 if it has a precision approach, 802 if it's a non-precision approach, which is what we had here, a VOR approach. Remember 2 things here. First of all, these are the standard minimums, and you want to check for alternate minimums there. That's in the front part of the terminal procedures publication. Easy to overlook that, but you want to look for that that sort of knockout A triangle symbol. That's your cue that you need to do a little more research and find out what the alternate minimums really are. Also remember, some people get confused that that's your minimums for using it as an alternate airport. That is not the minimums if you actually have to fly the approach. So if you end up going to your alternate and it has a VOR approach with minimums of 401, your minimums are 401. This 802, 602 in no way replaces the actual minimums for the approach you're flying. All right, 17. We're back to Riverside Municipal Airport, and you make a missed approach. What is the recommended entry for the holding pattern at Wissop intersection? You can see it there after you make the approach. Wissop intersection, sort of the middle left side of the chart there. What is our entry there? Either direct or teardrop, parallel or teardrop or direct. Here comes the poll. Take a last look at that chart. And please vote. All right, lots of votes coming in. Some of you may be furiously scribbling on the approach chart there. So if you haven't voted, get it in. I'll close it up in just a couple seconds. %, of you went with B, parallel or teardrop. 17% said direct or teardrop. 7% said teardrop or direct. All right, let's take a look at this. The answer is B. Correct. The correct answer is B, parallel or teardrop. Giving you some flexibility there. You know, in the bad old days, I think the answer would have been parallel. Period. A little more flexibility these days to sort of make it up as you prefer. Here's what I drew in ForeFlight. Just started marking up my chart, which can be helpful, by the way, so that you don't have to think of this if you actually do a missed approach. Go ahead and mark it up. But here's how I thought of it. You do the missed approach straight ahead, then climbing right turn to intercept this radial to Paradise, and then the radial out to Wissip intersection. I thought of it as a parallel, kind of your classic coming right in at it, flying the outbound course, then making a left turn around to intercept. The reason it's not that big a deal, the reason the option there is parallel or teardrop, for example, you know, ATC doesn't care. You have protected airspace around that holding area, especially on the side where you're making the turn. So as my instrument instructor said, if you want to cross the fix and do a Lomshavak and enter the hold, knock yourself out, ATC doesn't really care that much. But it does make sense for us to think about the right answer or the book answer and try to fly predictably if we can. So I would do a parallel entry there. Some people like the teardrop better because it gives you more space to intercept the inbound course. So in that case, you would hit Wissip, make a left turn outbound, and then swing back around with a right turn. Same basic idea, but as I said, that maybe gives you a little more room to intercept the inbound course coming inbound. All right, question 18. Let's move to some runway and taxiway markings. What is the distance? Now, I'm not going to tell you the airport because it doesn't matter, but what is the distance B from the beginning of the runway to the touchdown zone marker? You can see the different labels there, and we're on a precision instrument runway, you'll notice here. A, 750 feet, B, 500 feet, or C, 250 feet. Here comes the poll. All right, couple more seconds here. I will close it up, so get your votes in, please. All right, most of you are in agreement here again with B, 500 feet. 84% of you chose that one. And that's a good job. That's the correct answer. Lots of interesting information here. This is something I get rusty on. We all kind of know the basic markings, but you really can tell a lot about a runway from the markings. It's not just a random accumulation of white stripes out there. So this is AIM 2-3. The touchdown zone markings identify the touchdown zone for landing operations and are coded to provide distance information in 500 feet increments. These markings consist of groups of 1, 2, and 3 rectangular bars symmetrically arranged. You see the diagram though there, you know, each of these things has its own particular meaning. You've got the threshold markings before the actual runway number. You've got the touchdown zone markings. Those aiming point markings, those are the fat stripes. That's, you know, what many of us look at when we're on short final transitioning into the flare maybe. And there's a lot of information here. So this is a precision approach runway. There's even more to look at. You see at the top right on this slide, non-precision approach runway is a little different. You have the aiming point marking, but not all those other stripes. You still have the threshold markings. On a visual runway, so a runway with no instrument approach to it, you still have the aiming point, but you won't have the threshold markings. So that gives you a clue as to what type of approaches are available here. And then if you look at those threshold markings, those have a particular meaning too. So on a big 100-foot wide runway, you'll have 8 stripes. On a even wider 150 foot, you'll have 12 stripes. On a narrow one, you might only see 4. So that's very intentional. That's to help you judge the width and length of a runway. It's to help you find the runway environment when you break out on approach. So again, if you're at an unfamiliar airport, take some time and you know, look at that and think about what that's really telling you. Question 19, we've got 2 to go here. This one's airspace. Class G airspace is that airspace where A, the minimum flight visibility for VFR flight is 3 miles, B, ATC controls only IFR flights, or C, ATC does not control air traffic. Here comes the poll, and please vote. All right, just a couple more seconds. Here's your last chance to get your vote in if you haven't already. All right, another one where you agree. 83% went with C. ATC does not control air traffic. You all are good. You're either really sharp and on it or you're quick with your Google searches. Either way, good job. That's the right answer. ATC does not control air traffic. If you look in the AIM, all the airspace is grouped together except for Class G. Class G is sort of its whole own chapter because it is uncontrolled airspace. Class, C, D, B, A, they all have their variations and differences, but they're fundamentally controlled airspace. Class G is uncontrolled airspace. And here's the quote: ATC has no authority or responsibility to control air traffic. I honestly think this is great. This is one of the great parts about general aviation. You may have had this experience talking to a non-pilot and say, well, you have to file a flight plan for every flight. And, well, no, you don't. And that's part of that sort of the Class G world. So there's your refresher on airspace there. You obviously don't have to memorize all of that, but you can remember that Class G is uncontrolled. The takeaway there is, for an instrument pilot, when you break out of the clouds on an approach to a smaller airport that's in Class G airspace, you better be on the lookout because you may assume you're the only airplane there because you're IFR and ATC is holding the airport for you. And that's true IFR, but there may be somebody out there, Scud, running around the pattern and doing it perfectly legally. We could debate whether it's safe or not, but somebody could be absolutely out there VFR in the pattern, not talking to anybody, and you could be blundering into them right as you're burning down final looking for the runway. So if you're on approach at a Class G airport, make sure you're paying attention when you break out. Do not assume you own the airport just because you've got clearance for the approach. All right, last one. This one's a little bit tricky, I think, but most of us probably spend most of our time in radar contact talking to air traffic control. What does that actually mean when ATC says radar contact? What does that signify? A, your aircraft has been identified and you will receive separation from all aircraft while in contact with this radar facility. B, your aircraft has been identified on the radar display and radar flight following will be provided until radar identification is terminated. Or C, you will be given traffic advisories until advised the service has been terminated or that radar contact has been lost. Very specific answers there to a simple term. Here comes the poll. I've shortened those up just to make them a little more readable here. Choose one of the options here and we'll discuss it. All right, a lot of the votes in here. Give you just a couple more seconds. If you haven't voted, please make a selection. All right, a little less certainty on this one. 50%, half of you went with C. You'll be given traffic advisories until advised. 35% went with B, radar flight following will be provided, and 15% went with A. Let's dive into this one. The correct answer was B. Your aircraft has been identified on the radar display and radar flight following will be provided until radar identification is terminated. Lots to talk about there. The pilot controller glossary has really the only reasonable definition here, but here's quoting part of it. Pilots should discontinue position reporting over compulsory reporting points when informed by ATC that their aircraft is a radar contact. Well, that's good to know. That's essentially what it means, is that if your radar contact's lost, you need to start making those mandatory reporting points. It's a little more vague on the other ones, but I think it's worth pointing out that the traffic advisories is not in a coverall. A lot of you went with C there. You'll be giving traffic advisories. And ATC is responsible for separating IFR aircraft, but the VFR part is really done on a workload permitting basis. So you do not really technically have a guarantee that you'll be given full traffic advisories. In a lot of cases in everyday life, you'll have that, that's true, but that's not necessarily guaranteed. So don't assume that just because you're in radar contact that you'll hear about every traffic conflict. Hopefully you will, but you may not. So it pays to stay alert. Radar, when you check in with a departure and they say radar contact, that kind of feels good. The warm embrace of ATC, you're in the system. And that's true, but you're not really absolved of your responsibility to look for traffic. So just remember that. They're going to call out the key ones. They're going to call out the IFR ones for sure, but not necessarily every single one of them. All right, 20 for 20, good job. Many of you did quite well on that, so good job. You're current pilots. If you want to learn more, if you want to brush up on your skills, all kinds of options with Sporty's, our pilot training app again for iOS and Android. Check that out. A lot of good courses in there for keeping up to date, whether it's avionics or IFR flying or communications. Check out our YouTube channel for a recording of this webinar and lots of other webinars. We've been doing a bunch this summer, so lots of free opportunities for learning. Just search for Sporty's Pilot Shop on YouTube. Also want to point out airfaxjournal.com. That's a free website we do. This is an online version of a magazine that Leighton Collins, Richard Collins' father, founded way back in the 1930s. But we do lots of discussion about IFR flying on there, scenarios, video tips. So if you want to get your aviation fix online, check out airfaxjournal.com. And for future webinars, please check out sportys.com/webinars. We are always doing more of them. They are, as you see here, free to attend. Just sign up and learn something. With that, thank you very much for joining us today. Appreciate your attention. Hope to see you again on a Sporty's webinar in the future. Fly safely.